Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AROCSA's 5th annual conference. This is Kariman Shuair from the American University in Cairo. I have the honor to be sitting on AROCSA's board as the North African representative, and it's my absolute pleasure to be the host for today's event. Well, as you might already know, we usually meet for this event in person in one of the continent cities. However, with the pandemic and all its uncertainties, we thought that it might be more reasonable to host this year's conference virtually. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We're so happy to have you, even if it's only virtual. In this one-day event, we will be discussing and engaging in a couple of important and timely questions related to the sustainability of the civil society in our continent, with a special focus on issues related to inclusion, governance, and impact on communities. And luckily, we managed to pull together a wonderful set of speakers, either from academia, policy, or practice. And we also tried to come up with a pretty unique and proper setting that ensures inclusive and interactive conversations. So let's kick off today's event with a welcome address by our board chair, the director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, CAPSI, at the Wits University, Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo. Mr. Chair, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Karaman. Colleagues, I will be able to show my picture in a few minutes. I am actually addressing you from my car. I am picking up my son from school, and so that's the nature of our online working these days. A very hearty welcome to everyone who has made it so far. As Karaman has said, I'm the chair of the board, and on behalf of the AROCSA board, I want to welcome everyone, and I want to recognize each board member by name. As you know, we want to be represented across thematic areas, but also across the regions of the continent. And so we are represented on the board by Godwin, who is currently the Executive Secretary of Codesria based in Dakar, Senegal, but representing East Africa. We also have on the board Esi, who is based in Accra, Ghana, representing West Africa. We are represented also by Carmen, who is based in Cairo at the Keynote Center on Philanthropy, Civic Engagement, and Responsible Business, representing North Africa. We also are represented by Pinky, who is currently based, I think, in Mozambique, but she's from Botswana. She represents Southern Africa. And also joined by David, who works for Civicus, based in Johannesburg, but represents Central Africa. And of course, I sit as the board chair representing Pan-African ideals of AROCSA. So I wanted to start with the board representation, because I think that it's always good to talk about the governance of an institution. And part of the thematic focus for this conference is really about towards a sustainable civil society in Africa, with particular emphasis on issues that have to do with governance, inclusion, among others. And I want to talk to you about a couple of issues that I think are important as we start the conference. And these are born out of academic research, but also I think the last year and a half has really demonstrated the need for us to think very critically about what we need to put in place in order to build a sustainable civil society. So the first is the governance question. And right across the continent, a number of civil society organizations struggle with the question of governance and leadership in general. I don't think there's an issue when it comes to management, but I think there's a big issue when it comes to governance and leadership. And these two concepts are very important when we talk thinking about civil society. How is civil society governed and how is civil society led? What are the different key moments in civil society that help civil society to be strong? And I think the COVID situation has demonstrated that we need agile leadership. We need liquid leadership. We need colleagues that are able to lead during times of uncertainty, during times of instability. And that seems to have been a big question. If you look at studies that were done on the impact of COVID on civil society, it showed us that a number of our institutions across the continent had not taken into account issues of succession. They had not taken into account issues of key investments, especially in those areas that would help them pivot during times of instability. And one of those is technology. And so the lack of leadership in preparing our institutions to respond to any given pandemic or crisis is a question of governance, because it really starts at how the board and the trustees and those who are tasked with leading an institution are really thinking about positioning an institution. And overall, I think civil society in the continent seems to have been challenged on the issue of governance when it comes to leadership and forward thinking. But that's not the only thing in terms of governance that I think is important for us to think about. We also have to think about governance when it comes to resources, governance when it comes to strategy and development, governance when it comes to issues of partnership development and engagement. And I think the role of the board is an important one that we need to problematize, but also to position as an area of study, especially for the researchers that are ably represented here. So that was the first area that I thought is important for me to flag. The second area, and I'm sure our keynote speaker is going to address this. The second area is that of technology, and there's no other way we can be thinking about building a sustainable civil society without thinking about the virtual shifts that have taken place over the last couple of years, but more pronounced during this period of COVID. There's no doubt that there's been questions around how to pivot into the future of work. There's no doubt that there's been elements that have challenged civil society when it comes to moving to new ways of working, restructuring, finding new models of work, and enhancing and leveraging on technology as a new force to reckon with. What are the different platforms of economies, the economies of scale, and the opportunities that are provided by technology? And how can we use technology to build a future that is anti-fragile, a future that is sustainable? So I think there's a lot to think about when it comes to issues of technology. And I think a lot of the papers are going to also focus on that, and the discussion should really touch on that, because the future is virtual. The future is going to be in the cyberspace. And how do we govern the cyberspace, like I said? And there are lots of laws, there are lots of policies that have come about from different governments, different institutions that govern the cyberspace, in addition to the day-to-day operations of civil society. And this leads me to the third element, which I think is important for us to consider when we think about the sustainability of civil society, which is the regulatory environment. The regulatory environment for civil society across the continent mirrors that of the global space, but it's more pronounced in Africa because we tend to see lots and lots of oppressions, restrictions, whether in a legal format, in an administrative format, or in a political format. And so how do we even begin to think about the sustainability of civil society when the space keeps shrinking and it keeps shifting? So the concepts of the shrinking space and the shifting space are those that we need to interrogate in a conference like this, and how each country has positioned itself vis-a-vis civil society and its citizens is something that I think we should really be thinking about more deeply and in depth, and producing knowledge for policymakers to really think carefully about what policies they put in place. And then the final issue that I think is important for us going forward when it comes to thinking about sustainability is resource mobilization. And resource mobilization here, I'm not just talking about funds or money to sustain the activities of civil society. I'm talking about resources as they are defined in kind, in financial terms, and so forth and so on. And so the resources here are really everything that civil society needs to build this capacity. And it's going to talk about the politics of aid. It's going to talk about the pathologies that are associated with how civil society is constructed in different countries, moreover shaped by the different colonization processes that took place. And you will know that currently there is a shift, or rather a move by international institutions to locate themselves in the global south. That creates a big problem for civil society when it comes to issues of resource mobilization.
In addition, there is a growth in resources that are available continentally, either from high net worth individuals, from philanthropies, from the private sector, but more often these resources are not channeled appropriately. And so we need to think about how to work very closely with these different sectors in order to raise the resources that are needed to sustain the interventions of civil society. So colleagues, I wanted to just raise a few of those key issues because I've seen them to be more prevalent during this period. And I just don't think we could have a conference on civil society and its sustainability without referring to some of these big issues. There are others that I think my colleagues are also going to touch on. So I want to end on this. Thank you very much, everyone, for making the time. I want to thank the AROCSA board. I want to thank the committee that was responsible for the planning. I want to thank our supporters, in particular the Ford Foundation. I also want to thank the ANOVA and the Lilly School who have been working very closely with us and bringing us to where we are today as AROCSA. I also want to thank, in particular, the researchers and the PhDs that got awards, because these awards are the ones that are the bedrock of the theme and the conference that we are involved in. So thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you very much, Shani. I will end here, and I wish everyone the best in the deliberations that are going to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Becky. Very great insight to start from and keep in mind while having today's conversation. And now with the keynote address by one of the founding board members, Esi. Esi is the CEO of Access Human Capital. Dr. Esi, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Carmen. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where on the planet you find yourself. It's a wonderful opportunity for me. I'm usually on the other side, helping to organize, etc. And I have the opportunity to speak. I'm going to kill my video just so that I can have a stable connection as I speak, and I'll keep it brief so we can get on with the papers already. All right, so really grateful for the opportunity to be part of the conference in a different capacity. I've journeyed with AROCSA since 2015 when we had the first planning meeting in Accra and our first gathering of stakeholders in Lagos in May 2016. And we've come a long way and a lot has changed in the world around us. Now, one thing that has remained constant, however, in the middle of all the change is the need and the call for sustainability of CSOs. It's extremely important. And this has remained constant and has taken on new dimensions with a lot of urgency, especially when we review the last 2 years. The kind of changes that we've seen around us have really exacerbated the existing inequalities, the exclusion of groups from economics and economic policy, intellectual and social activities within our societies. And the world is in flux, and we're at the point where we need CSOs that can be resilient enough to provide a sense of stability and maintain the connections to multiple stakeholders in the policy arena, and also in practice and in academia. So this is a time that is critical and requires civil society organizations to reassess where they sit, especially because there are tensions with regard to crackdowns and the tightening of the civic space, and also amazing opportunities to deliver and amazing opportunities to engage people differently. And with all these changes around that, it's even more important to gather data, document and preserve knowledge, and begin to interpret the world around us and find meaning through research. And with the state of flux that we're in, one may ask, is it even worth, gathering data and documenting? Yes, for the sake of posterity and just generating knowledge and learning and interpreting what's going on around us. And there's also the need for collaboration between field workers, policymakers, and CSOs, so that we can build that resilience and make sense of the new world around us. And this, for me, is really important because it highlights the mission and the focus of AROCSA. It makes it even more important that there's a need to bridge the gap between scholarship, research and practice. It's more urgent now than ever. And there's a lot of work we need to do in bridging that gap and staying relevant. Now, context matters. And so it's important to check, the context we're in. And 2 organizations I'll recommend to you if you haven't come across them, to understand the context of what is going on, the pulse on the continent of Africa. Look up Civicus and look up Afrobarometer. I don't want to presume that everybody on the call is familiar with these 2 amazing organizations that help us with data, information, to understand what's going on the continent around us. And it's easy when you look at the work they're doing to see the tensions between the triumph of civil society in our age and the struggles of civil society as well. And we learned that more than 35 African countries have sought international funding, worth $16 billion from the IMF to deal with COVID-19 related challenges. And we also learned that more than 20 African countries have applied for debt suspension under the G20 debt service suspension initiative. We're still digging ourselves deeper and deeper into the hole and the abyss of debt. And in the middle of all of this, there's the strong perception of corruption. There's the strong perception of misappropriation of funds. And one of the most recent Afrobarometer surveys indicate that more than 50% of the citizens who were surveyed in countries including Senegal and Togo, Liberia, believe that relief funds, for example, have been unfairly distributed. And on the average, about 70% of all those surveyed see corruption and evidence of funds that have disappeared. And so we find ourselves in a very unique space where we can see there's a lot more going on in the governance space, economic policies that are being initiated, new taxes so that governments can fund relief initiatives, etc. And we also learn that in the midst of all of this, where government, where organizations, individuals, academic institutions are trying to find their feet. If you look at the 2021 Civicus State of Civil Society report, they tell us that while civil spaces have been tightened, civil society has also stepped up to fill the gaps left by the state and the market. So there's a lot to lament and there's a lot to celebrate in this space. Now, just a little context, and then let's look at 4 key things. Now, in the face of the pandemic, a lot of CSOs have mobilized support for communities, distributing food, Community-based organizations are providing emergency and sanitary supplies and engaging in advocacy, especially for vulnerable groups, and providing healthcare and psychological services. I myself consider myself to be more of a practitioner than anything. I work with an organization that works with senior citizens, and seeing the impact of the pandemic and having to be home by themselves or be home with other people, but be excluded because of the lack of familiarity with technology, etc., and how that has spiraled into depression, mental health challenges. You know, these are issues worth considering, worth exploring as academics and as practitioners. And when gender-based violence, soared under the lockdown conditions, many CSOs set up, helplines, creating safe spaces and engaging in advocacy. And so we see the deliberation on issues concerning governance, inclusion, resilience, sustainability, all coming to a head. And against this backdrop, it's important to ask ourselves, where must scholars and CSOs channel their energies in order to ensure that they are resilient, that they are resourceful, and that they are relevant enough to thrive and continue to make an impact in their work. And so I want to touch on a few factors. I think our AROCSA board chair, Dr. Moyo, covered the same points and issues that I want to highlight. And so he's done half the work for me already. And the first I want to touch on is leadership and governance. And these factors, 4 factors that I want to share, really should serve as raw material for intellectual debate, for research, for actual interventions by relevant stakeholders. Now, leadership and governance in a world of flux. What kind of leader do we need? We've seen the rise and the posture of populist COVID-19 denying leaders, and how this is related to the posture of citizens. It would be great to see work, research on how the posture of our leaders, leadership, the nature of leadership that we see is related to the posture of citizens in managing the pandemic. When the leader rubbishes science and the studies, vaccine, all the issues around the pandemic, what happens to the people? Do we have a state where the people, citizens, academics look for alternate leadership, or do we go along with the leadership that we are offered? Now that provides space for inquiry, social inquiry. When it comes to leadership and governance, there's also allocation of relief resources. I mentioned that earlier, and how transparency and access to information about initiatives has eroded public trust in government. When you look at the work done by Afrobarometer, they highlight this quite strongly. And when you see the lack of transparency, lack of access to information, a lot of misinformation, you also see how this has fueled agitation from the ground up. The tensions are real, and the tensions cut across various strata of society and the various demographic groups within society. There's a need to also investigate the growth of interest in governance. When the pandemic started, many businesses had to shut down. People who work in the informal sector, especially young people in the informal sector, people who are selling on the streets, were heavily impacted, by the policy changes, by the lockdown situation, etc. It's worth investigating whether this has led to these groups, these demographic groups, becoming more interested in governance issues because they are acutely affected by the policies, etc., this is a good time to investigate the role of the middle class in governance, and whether the direct effect of the pandemic and all the issues it comes with, whether that has built up an interest in governance and people are paying more attention, especially where under the lockdown situations, you've had many people at home, glued, you know, to, in Ghana, for example, we have periodic updates. And while some will look at that and hold on to and latch on to that, you have those who see that information sharing as a great way of beginning to pay attention to governance and begin questioning policy, questioning leadership, holding leadership accountable. And so when you look at the context we find ourselves in, it's a great opportunity for scholars. It's a great opportunity for practitioners to investigate issues around leadership and governance, and how we can leverage the season, leverage a time such as this to learn more about, you know, policy processes, digitization, the moving online, for example, of some meetings, press conferences, convenings. What does that do when it comes to literacy and excluding groups that may not be literate, access to information? These are worth investigating. Now, segueing into inclusion, that's the second factor I want to touch on. Beyond leadership and governance, inclusion and the need for being intentional, the need for intentionality, so that we can prevent, where possible, and manage pockets and spaces that nurture agitation and unrest. We've seen the NSAS movement in Nigeria, we've seen the Fix the Country movement in Ghana, and we've seen political leadership crack down or use the legal system, you know, to dismiss, control, oppress such movements. And the more tense the situation is, the more we see a rise and the opening up of more spaces for youth to find their voices. And so you find that youth across the continent, especially those who are unemployed, those engaged in the informal sector, have felt the turbulence a lot more acutely and have decided to initiate change using whatever means possible. And so when we start thinking of being intentional with regard to governance and inclusion, we need to look at the youth. We need to look at the various pockets of young people across this continent who, within this current context and season, have felt the need to speak up and rise up. How do we manage those spaces? How do we allow citizen voice, citizen participation, and be inclusive, and yet to engage them in a way that does not fuel unrest and agitation? That's important. It is also critical to engage and study vulnerable populations, the elderly, children, people with physical challenges, mental health challenges, and people who, even before the pandemic, were excluded, people who sat or existed on the fringes of society in many ways, and understanding how they are affected by the flux in the world right now and how they are managing the change, transitioning through this period. We talk about the new norm, and it's worth investigating, especially for groups that have hitherto been excluded. With the move to online engagement in convenings and, you know, within education, there are online classes for children from primary school all the way through to the university. There are meetings online. What happens to the non-literate masses on the continent of Africa? That's a question worth investigating. Are we creating a situation where we're leaving a huge segment behind? And this becomes an issue of information flow, especially where we're using media outside the context of local languages. And this provides an opportunity for us, a really golden opportunity to build the capacity of local language media outlets, for example, and initiatives by civil society organizations to reach down to the people, the masses, who may be excluded by virtue of the use of technology in almost everything that we're doing. By virtue of that new norm, become excluded. How do we respond as a people? How do we respond as academics? What can we learn from some of these changes with online engagement and the subsequent or consequent exclusion of the non-literate masses? And so, one, leadership and governance; two, inclusion, being intentional about inclusion, and this serving as a topic and a theme that we can investigate further, because there are many groups that are excluded from this new norm. Third is linked, and this is information flow, media and citizen participation. We've seen misinformation, we've seen the spread of many conspiracy theories, we've seen social media crackdowns on Twitter, and we've seen attacks in Ghana, for example, on journalists as the tensions rise, as the citizens and the media, or some parts of the media, ask for and push for accountability. We see a crackdown on that, on the information flow. What can we learn? What data can we gather? What are some of the trends in reporting, the nature of reporting, the nature of engagement? And this serves as a very fertile ground for new research, fertile ground for research and for interventions as well. How do we make sure that the citizen voice is not lost in the misinformation and in the conspiracy theories and relying on anecdotal information that shows up on social media, evidently? How do we also begin as academics, as scholars, to take the information, the knowledge we create, the knowledge we generate, and actually break it down such that society can participate? How do we take the information that we generate, information that is useful, and take on the responsibility of packaging it such that the average person on the street, who because of the pandemic, because of the world in flux, is more acutely aware and more ready to engage in governance, in citizen movements, etc. How do we make sure that information, the right information, is flowing to them? And accuracy of data, the flow of data, access to data, these become important with COVID-19 relief efforts around the continent, the right to information, access to information on funding and the use of funds. These become important. And so beyond leadership and governance, where we can engage and understand the world around us, beyond being intentional in including the various segments of our society, there's also the need for us to investigate the flow of information, the nature of the information we receive and circulate. And then lastly, the operational sustainability of CSOs. This is extremely important. Now, when you look at some of the studies done by WACSI, the West Africa Civil Society Institute, you read of CSOs that have had to create, mobile and remote work options where those didn't exist. And this is not unique to CSOs. This is, regular private companies, community-based organizations, academic institutions. We have all had to move our engagement offline to online and telecommute, working from home. If you run a CSO, it's really important to critically take on technology and figure out how do we use that in our service delivery. How do we use that not just in our advocacy, but in service delivery, in the actual work, operational work that we do. It would be interesting to see how CSOs are adapting and changing and shifting as things happen around us. And it also creates a lot of room for creativity and collaboration. Now, that's one of the things that sometimes there's a dichotomy between the private sector, the public sector, and the non-profit sector or CSO space. And we fail to see a lot of collaboration. We're in a time and a season where collaboration is even more important. If you think of mobile technology on the continent of Africa, it forms the foundation and the cracks of a lot of the financial transactions that go on. So whether you're looking at M-Pesa, whether you're looking at mobile money across the networks in Africa, there's room for civil society organizations who deliver services, who conduct research in partnership with academic institutions to leverage mobile technology, for example. That means the coming together of telcos with civil society organizations, with scholars, and this mix of stakeholders beginning to do more work together, understanding how we can leverage each other's capacity. And this, for me, is a really critical point for civil society organizations to be creative, to be collaborative, and to begin investigating cross-sectoral work, to begin investigating and pursuing interventions that will leverage all the tools available to us, and sharing the information widely. Hopefully, this really short conversation has given you a few things to think about with regard to leadership and governance and the questions that we can ask when we see our world in flux. Hopefully, this has given you some food for thought on inclusion and studying and creating interventions for populations that have been left out of our new norm and new context. And hopefully this has also given you food for thought on information flow, the media, citizen engagement and participation, and how we take governance, from being mainly offline to online, and the information flow and the guarding of freedoms within the media space. And lastly, operational sustainability of CSOs and the need to look beyond philanthropy, for example, and start thinking of how to generate funds that will keep CSOs going. And in doing this, leveraging technology, leveraging partnerships across sectors. And as we continue with this conversation through the papers and through the various breakout sessions and discussions, it is my hope that we'll begin to talk about innovation, collaboration, inclusion, and all these issues that Dr. Moyo has touched on, and some of them that I've also touched on, so that we can have rich conversations, rich discussions, and by the time we're done with the conference, to identify potential for collaboration between scholars and practitioners, because really that is what AROCSA is all about. So thank you very much for the opportunity to have me share a few thoughts on the theme that we have for this year's conference, looking at how we sustain civil society and looking at the pillars of inclusion, governance, and the impacts that we make. Thank you very much, and I will hand over back to Shani. Thank you. And back to Karaman. There we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Esi, for the amazing notes. Many important, timely, and challenging key issues to consider and think about as academics, practitioners, or policymakers concerned with civil society affairs. So thank you for that.